be hearing now from Kay on creating the future with AI.
Thank you for that introduction, Tracy. And this is going to be a gallop through AI. Tracy, I think you have my slides, or someone has my slides, so we can start. What we will find when we gallop through AI is that although I have heard already lots of people talking about education and AI, I think there are fundamental flaws that we need to fix before we beta test on our children with AI. And I'll come back to that in more detail. But I wanted to start with, where I do think that there are some great applications of AI, and where some of those great applications, Tracy, if we could go to slide 3, where some of those great applications also need for us to think very carefully about how we apply AI. So some of my favorite applications are in healthcare, but what you're going to hear from me is the problems rather than the great things we can do with AI. And so you'll go away thinking, well, Kay doesn't like AI very much, but actually I think that AI has fantastic opportunities for us. What I really think, especially in the age of generative AI, when we're seeing everybody going as fast as we can on the hype cycle, that we actually need to stand back and say, where do we want to put humans in AI and where do we want AI? Because now is the time for us to have that discussion. We don't want to wake up in 2050 and find out that we didn't have that discussion and AI is everywhere and in places that we don't want it to be. So in healthcare, for example, many countries, we have a staffing crisis. And so it might be that AI would be great to deploy in healthcare. But what are the things that we need to think about in healthcare? Well, first of all, AI, a lot of people are using mental health, AI and mental health. But a lot of people then think that AI is empathic. We really need to get people to understand this tool and that it can't possibly be empathic. It can't possibly appear as if, whilst it's appearing empathic, it actually isn't empathic. And I want to tell you a story, 2 stories. One, on the staffing crisis, when I was at the forum, we did work with Rwanda around a chatbot that did triage care. And in Rwanda at that time, there were 27,000 people for every 1 doctor. And so the idea of the chatbot was to be able to elevate the people who are really sick to the doctor, to support, and help those people who, and send those people away who didn't need quite the same level of medical care. To me, that means problems of an ethical nature, although with AI, we tend to talk about responsible or trustworthy AI now rather than ethics, because it's really hard as you try to bring a community globally together where everybody has very different ethical principles to apply. But as we'll find out later in this talk, everybody can agree on some responsible directions for AI. So one of the things that I think is really hard with that Rwanda situation is, do we simply say, if you live in the global north, you don't need doctors, we'll put in AI and AI will be the thing that solves everything for everybody. Whereas if you live in the global north, you probably get a doctor. And my story, it really sort of develops from that worry that I have about, do you get your medical care from AI or a doctor? Does it matter? So I often have more questions for you than I have answers. So in my own story, I got breast cancer last summer. I will tell you that I am totally better, so we can put that on one side. But in the course of that journey, I obviously have an oncologist. I say obviously because I'm privileged to live in the global north and be able to afford one. And so when I was talking to my oncologist, she said, well, Kay, wouldn't it be amazing if we had an AI to walk you through your journey with breast cancer? And I said, well, actually, no, I really would like you to walk me through my journey with breast cancer. I'd like the human being to be there for me every step of the way. I don't want the AI to be there. But I also recognize that perhaps if I didn't speak English, my doctor speaks English, then maybe I could be walked through my journey with AI in my own language. That sounds amazing as well. But again, does it actually give disparate care? And so one of the things that I said to my oncologist is that I think it's really important that you talk to your patients, and we use AI in the background to take the notes and do all the work that you're normally doing, that takes up your time and stops you talking to the patient. So I'm sure there'll be lots of thoughts, and that's why I think that it's such an important conversation. Where do we put the human and where do we put the AI? And does it matter that we have disparate experiences of human and AI? Can we go to the next slide, please? So looking at greenhouse emissions, you may have noticed that both Microsoft and Google blew through their 2030 sustainability targets. They say it's because of generative AI, and of course it is. Generative AI is extremely bad for the environment, but Microsoft and Google suggest, and I think the jury's out, that generative AI might be able to solve all of our climate change problems, and so therefore it will have a positive effect, and so it doesn't matter that they're blowing through their sustainability targets. Again, we could talk about that, but when you ask ChatGPT, for example, one of those algorithms, a question, prompt, just be mindful that it uses 1/4 liter of water every time you do. So please just ask it good questions. Don't ask it random, stupid questions. Obviously, there's a balance here, and PwC has a study out that says by 2030, using AI will reduce carbon emissions equal to the whole of Australia, Canada, and Japan's carbon emissions. And we all know that one of the early success stories for DeepMind was a 30% reduction in energy consumption in data centers for Google when Google bought them back in 2014. We also know that AI is very good if you can get it into the fields through connected devices at helping us to water properly, to apply the right pesticides and the right herbicides in agriculture, and that increases farmers' income as well. So these are some huge benefits, but we really need to think about the downside too. So next slide, please. Just some other things that I think that AI is really good at doing. Drug discovery. It's able to sort through masses of scientific literature and come up with new ideas for drugs. It looks as if we will be able to stop some of the testing and some of the early trials, and that will mean that drugs come to market quicker. It's also really good at identifying, because if you remember, this is a pattern recognition system. So it's good at X-rays, it's good at identifying defective product. And defective product is very costly to the environment. Every time we send something back and it's rejected, then that's a huge cost to the environment. So using AI to stop defective production is a huge benefit. Banking the unbanked, I work with a company that's based in the Philippines, but generally in Asia. And, you know, we're looking at using AI to see if there are interesting and novel ways of finding people that we could actually give credit to and get them started on their banking journey. I haven't got a lot of time. We can talk about any of these things in the next area, or of course you can come. You can ask me directly. So next slide, please. So where are we seeing most of the uses of generative AI? Mustafa Suleyman, who used to be who started DeepMind and then Inflection and is now at Microsoft, wrote an article some years ago saying it's such a shame that some of the greatest minds on the planet are focused on using AI to sell soda rather than solving the solving the clean water challenge. And if we go to the next slide, you can see how that's repeating itself. This is where most people are using generative AI. And obviously, they might all be really useful for companies, but they aren't really useful, apart from modern slavery, perhaps, in helping the planet and helping those who most need to move forward in their lives. So next slide, please. One of the things that I said at the beginning was about hype. There's a lot of hype around generative AI, and I think what citizens think about AI is driven partly by the hype and also by the social media issues around disinformation and misinformation. So with that caveat, let's go to the next slide and look at what people actually think. Well, in November, Americans were polled in a number of different ways, as you can see, the YouGov, Gallup, Axios, and APA. And most people were very worried about AI, worried about what its effect on their election, worried about workers losing their jobs, worried about the fact that companies, especially in America, are self-governing what they do with AI, as opposed to having any regulatory legislation through America. And also they were worried about superintelligence. I'm not going to talk about superintelligence. We can talk about that after I've spoken if you want to. Next slide, please. So widening the aperture to 32,000 people around the world that Edelman surveyed in February. Basically, everybody was worried about AI, and they really want companies and governments to prioritize transparency and responsible AI. So here's the quote from the Global Technology Chair at Edelman. And then next slide brings us up to date. This was a survey done in June, or maybe at the end of May. So it was done by Reuters, Oxford University, and the BBC, and it surveyed 12,000 people in Denmark, UK, Argentina, USA, France, and Japan. A large proportion of them had used ChatGPT or similar once or twice. That was 7% of people in the US, 2% in the UK said that they use ChatGPT on a daily basis. Much smaller recognition of any other generative AI tool all countries, 47% in the US and 42% in the UK, hadn't even heard of ChatGPT, sorry, people in all countries. The two categories where they were using it were creating media and getting information. In creating media, most said they were simply playing around or experimenting, writing an email or letter, or making an image. These are the costly for the environment uses of AI. And then the others was getting information. And of course, you know, they're asking it factual questions or asking it for advice, probably without realizing the level of hallucination that is still going on with these algorithms, and therefore not necessarily getting the factual advice that they sought. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to talk now about global governance of AI. If we are to truly understand where the human is and where AI is, and not just be pushed down the road to everybody using AI because it's trendy, then we need to think very carefully about AI governance. So next slide, please. I see AI governance as the same as cars and seat belts. We drive faster because we have seat belts. We survive better because we have seat belts. I'm not talking about stopping innovation with AI. I'm talking about having guardrails in there. And if we do AI poorly, it actually results in large bills to dismantle it and make it right. So when I talk to companies, nonprofits, anybody who's going to be deploying AI, you need to start with it right from the beginning, because otherwise, if you don't think about anything else other than you don't think about society or anything about your bottom line, it's going to be expensive to get it wrong. So next slide, please. I want to remind everybody about this definition from the OECD and the EU, because as I said earlier, we tend to see this as a friend. For example, Replica, a chatbot system, recently shut down because it had been created to help boys learn how to talk to girls. A very good thing, you might think. But actually, the boys got very, very attracted to and into intense relationships with the robot or the bot. This is not human. Let's not give it, let's not address it as a human being. It's a pattern matching device. Next page, slide, please. Okay, so I said earlier that the world actually agrees on what is responsibility. One of the problems is that we don't actually all agree how to get there. So these are the things that the world agrees. And how do I know that? Well, when I was at the forum, we looked at about 190 different principles that have come up all over the world, and distilled these things from them all. Everybody's worried about bias, fairness, security, reliability, and robustness, privacy, explainability and transparency, human agency. Where is the human in AI? Accountability, your AI being lawful, sustainability, and safety. The Gartner study expects by 2026 for there to be 50% electricity rationing by 2026 across the world. That's a figure that we really need to be thinking about as we think about climate and we think about AI and how we see sustainability. Next slide, please. So is there any global regulation? No. The UN's in conversation. There is a Treaty of Europe. We expect it to be signed by all the European countries and the US and some others. Not yet. There is great work out of OECD, GPay, the Forum, the World Economic Forum, but there's no global regulation. Next slide, please. There is regulation in many countries, and this is just a small proportion of them. China is heavily the use of AI between businesses and customers is heavily regulated. It isn't regulated between citizens and government. India is looking at regulation. Brazil has an act on the books making its way through. Mexico has a number of privacy legislation making their way through or in force. Australia has some great legislation around AI, and particularly around revenge porn and deep fakes. And in the Middle East, we see that Saudi Arabia and UAE don't have AI law, but do have privacy rules. Next slide, please. If we go to the United States, I think it's important that actually wherever you are in the world, there may be existing laws and regulations that are open to you to govern AI. And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. So in Canada, Air Canada had a chatbot that missold an air ticket to someone. And Air Canada's defense when they were taken to court was that although the chatbot was on its website, the chatbot was not made by it. That defense was not felt to be appropriate, and Air Canada had to pay damages for the chatbot. OpenAI, as you probably know, is facing a number of copyright lawsuits across the world. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, I think, is a good example of what all the regulators are doing in the US, and we're seeing it also in the UK, where, again, they don't have law around in the same way as the European Union does, and I'll come to that in a moment. So the EEOC has publicly said that it doesn't matter whether you use a person to discriminate in hiring or a bot to discriminate in hiring, they will still sue you for that discrimination. And that, to give you an idea of existing law, that goes back to the Civil Rights Act of the 1960s. So regulators are getting creative in where they look for taking on misuse of generative or simply AI uses. Google and Microsoft have actually said that they will indemnify people against breach of copyright if they are using their chatbots. There is an executive order from President Biden and a NIST framework, which and lots of work that is being done across the United States. There is a patchwork of state laws as well. This makes companies that I talk to shudder. 1/3 of states now have AI or privacy legislation, and I just want to show you some of that in the next slide. Colorado's ahead of everybody. It passed the Colorado Artificial Intelligence Act, which will come into force in February 2026. It applies to developers and deployers. It requires them to take reasonable care to protect customers. And it talks about high-risk AI systems. And you will see, and I think it's important that you look at this and think about this in the context of where you are in the world. It deals with education, employment, financial work, healthcare, government service, housing, insurance, and legal services. And when you look at that, you then look at the EU AI Act, which you might want to do if you're thinking about how do I in my country think about introducing governance and persuading the government to govern AI. This might be a roadmap, and this looks very similar to the EU AI Act. So next slide, please, Tracy. And I'm very happy for everybody to have my slides, so you don't have to read this. Next slide. What it's requiring is an annual impact assessment, which can be done in-house or by a third party, of all the ways that you use algorithms. So it is very comprehensive legislation. Next slide, please. Okay, so what's happening in the EU and the UK? In the UK, there's SEMA, and they're using existing rules, which, as I mentioned before, the EU AI Act, one of the questions that we have around that, it came into force this year, is we saw the world use the GDPR as a template, and lots of people adopted around the world the GDPR in some form or fashion. What we don't know is whether the EU AI Act is going to be that template, but looking at Colorado, it looks as if it may be. Next slide, please. Basically, the EU splits out risk levels of using AI to unacceptable. That's social credit scoring, for example, like they have in China, high, limited, or no risk. And they were going to pass it, and then they had to go back and think about the impact of generative AI, which is now included. Next slide, please. They also have in train product liability legislation, and this will treat algorithms, so software, exactly the same as physical product. You know, if you cause damage with a physical product, I don't know, a can of something blows up in your face and you have damage, then you can sue. It's applying the same thing to AI. Next slide, please. And the timeline starts on the 10th of June, 2024. So we will see the first prohibitions on unacceptable risk coming in December. Next slide, please. So I personally think there is a terrible need for self-regulation, because unless you're in the EU or potentially in Brazil, or in Colorado, there really isn't very much legislation out there. And so what I try to persuade companies and nonprofits that I deal with is that the best thing they can do is to create good self-regulation. That means that anybody who sits on a board needs to understand AI and how it's being used in their company. The C-suite needs to understand in detail how AI is being used and what it is. And then they need to give permission to everybody in their company to think about how do we deploy responsible AI. One of those things is to create diverse teams. So as you can see, I'm an old white woman. Most of the AI teams are young men under 30. And so, you know, how do they create something for me? Diversity, bringing diversity into that team, and that creation is important. I want to encourage all of you to do AI Education 101. You can find it all over the web. It's the key to understanding what it can do, what it can't do, what it will do, and what it'll do for your jobs. And, you know, if you understand that, then you can begin to manage how you feel about AI and answer that question that I posed at the beginning. Where do we want humans? Where do we want AI? Can we go to the next slide, please? Tracy? I think Tracy, next slide. Thank you. So now I want to think outside the box a little bit. And can we go to the next slide, please? What I want to tell you, because I think it is vitally important to this conversation that we are having today, is that although there are about 2 million users of ChatGPT, and I'm not picking on ChatGPT, we could say of generative AI, they are mainly based in the global north, and 46% of them are white men living in America. If you set that against the 3 billion people who are actually unconnected to the internet, you have a major problem with any of these generative AI systems, because actually what you've got is a generative AI system that chooses from data that has been created mainly in the global north and mainly by white guys who've had the pen since the beginning of data creation. And China, of course, has its own closed web. So you've got mainly white men who have created data. Women didn't get to create data probably until the 18th century when people like Jane Austen started writing books. And so what we have is a system that is skewed towards white men, and we are asking it questions about what we should do across the world. Where are the voices of women? Where are the voices of persons of color? Where are the voices of the 3 billion people who are unconnected? They're not here. So unless we really think carefully about this data issue, we are going to continue with the politics and the way that we have constructed our society into the future. AI doesn't help us move on because it doesn't have the data available. Next slide, please. So let's look at that in a little bit more detail. I'm just going to take 2 things from here. Cannibalism. Cannibalism is the word that we give to AI creating its own data. And so every time you ask it a question, it creates data. Might be right, might be wrong, but it creates data, and that data drops back into the data lake that it draws from next time. That's cannibalization. It is expected that by the middle, so in a year's time, 50% of data is going to have been created by AI. So how do we as women, and how do we as persons of color, and how do we as the rest of the world actually deal with this question? As I said, it's urgent today. I was at a breakfast meeting the other day of women in AI, and we were saying, well, you know, do we all go on to generative AI and start plugging in our data? Maybe, but we have a very, very short time period to make a difference. And so we need to make a difference with regulation, with governance, or at least of us all thinking about it. And so that's what I'm encouraging you to do today. Next slide, please. So what does AI give us? It gives us something that's in the middle. I call it gray mush. We know that it's really good at bringing people who don't have skills up to the median. What we don't see is it bringing people from the median up to truly skilled. So what does that do to creative thought? We can generate social media posts that all look the same with AI. But what do we want? So what do we want of this system? Next slide, please. This is true, in my mind, true creativity. It's a photograph of a video, so it's not very good, of Rafik Anadol's installation in 2023 at Davos. This is a coral reef reimagined using AI. Next slide, please. So how does AI affect jobs? Well, it doesn't take away jobs. It takes away parts of jobs. But if you take away enough parts of jobs, then you actually take away whole jobs of people. So JP Morgan has a study out that says we can do with 44% less lawyers. That may or may not be a good thing, she says, as a lawyer. And Morgan Stanley has a study out saying that they could do away with 2/3 of their financial analysts. So AI is affecting the way that we work and who works, blue collar and white collar workers. And in my view, we need to work. I love working, but I also love doing my garden and playing with my puppy. But, you know, what's the balance? Again, something we need to think about today. And on to the next slide. Do we use AI to interview people for jobs? Do we use AI to write their appraisals of their jobs? Next page, slide. How do we choose the managers and leaders of the future if it turns out that actually everybody's just at the median because they're using AI? Next slide, please. What's the economic consequences? Well, increased productivity from fewer people. But does it matter that there are fewer people? Because actually everywhere around the world, population rates are plummeting. In some places like Korea, much faster than in other places, but even in many countries in the global north, we are seeing plummeting populations. So does that mean that actually we need AI to do all the things that otherwise we couldn't be doing? So that's the trade-off here. And I will stop there because I know I'm over my time and I see hundreds of questions.
Wow, thank you so much for updating us on all the AI news and effects in the world. Where should we begin? Yeah.
What's you're looking for one, I just want to remind everybody that we will probably be cared for by AI and embodied in robots as we grow older, because it seems that people don't want to care for elders. And so we have a unique chance now to talk about, you know, how do we want to be cared for by those robots. And I said that I wanted to come back to education. I am very, as I said, very against beta testing on our most vulnerable people, i.e. our children. And when I was at the forum, we did some work called the Smart Toy Awards, where we actually looked at toys that were AI enabled, and we asked questions about them. What was the curriculum? Very hard to find. Were they using facial recognition and voice recognition? And what was happening to the children's data arising from that? Could it be sold to third parties? 95% of the toys on sale in America are actually based in, are sold out of China. Have we thought about, and we certainly haven't studied, what's the impact on a child that loses when its AI companion dies, given that it's been very close to it and been talking to it? And what does it do to our children's relationships with other children? You know, if you've had a toy that has been nice to you, and then you go to school and all those humans make you cry, maybe that's not good. But what we don't know is any of the answers to these questions. In Germany, they actually mandated that a doll called My Friend Kayla be destroyed as a spying device. Are they hackable? So let's just get all this right before we use it for education.
Absolutely. The question about the water was interesting to many people. Can you explain more about how the ChatGPT usage affects water consumption?
Yeah, absolutely. It's about cooling. Data centers need electricity and cooling. And so it's about the water used for cooling.
Got it. That's really interesting. What about the use of AI in schools? Youth are becoming dependent on it rather than learning how to do research and write.
Undoubtedly, as I say, this is such a large conversation we should be having. But you know, where do our top performers live? How do we gauge whether a less good performer has been raised to the median? Does it matter where people sit because we've all got AI? What does it do to creative thinking? So my diatribe earlier about the data that AI is drawing from, it just means that we're doing the same thing as that we've always done. We need people to really think critically about the message that they are putting out and what they're getting out of generative AI.
Excellent. Providing damage caused by AI sounds challenging. What is a metric for damage caused by AI?
So this is, as I say, two things that oh, okay, let me back up. How do you prove damage caused by AI? It's hard. So supposing an algorithm was biased and you applied for a job and you didn't get the job because the algorithm was biased. Unless you ask questions of the potential of the person you wanted to work for about how much the AI was part of it, you have no clue. So, you know, every time you apply for a job, you have no clue whether AI is being used or not, unless you ask those questions. If you ask those questions, then you may be able to go to your regulator and say, I think that I was damaged as a result of this. With the EU, there'll be new regulations around that.
What are the potential downline impacts of lack of diversity in AI regulation?
Huge, huge. If we don't have diversity in AI, we will continue with the world that we have at the moment. And that, to me, would be one of the largest human tragedies that we could imagine.
Thank you. You mentioned this a bit, maybe you can highlight it more. What impact does AI have on job automation and the future of work?
Yes, so all the studies say that there will be more jobs created by AI than are lost from AI. And I am not here to dispute that. There is we should look at it critically, in my view. We should also look critically at when that happens. So if you look at the Industrial Revolution, it took over 100 years to sort of get everybody back on an even keel and begin to build those new jobs. So we need to have some timelines around that. But as I said, we are seeing a reduction in population. And so that will sort of mitigate some of these issues. But one of the things that we're not talking about that I think we should is the downstream effects on society of, the financial analyst at Morgan Stanley losing their job. That financial analyst is probably also paying for their house to be repaired often, a new car or 3, chauffeurs to get them to the airport and back, gardeners, maid service, air transport, new washing machines, all sorts of things that suddenly they can't be paying for. And so if you get a lot of job loss at the top, where there's a lot of money being made by those people who lose their job, that will have economic consequences.
Very interesting. Thank you. Is it possible to do a massive data input that accurately reflects diversity?
I think we should try. Whether it's possible for us to try now and counteract centuries of what's in the internet at the moment, it's hard to know.
Yeah, understood. Would a global AI system that collects women's views into a central repository help to bring women's voices into balance with the global AI database?
Yes.
Yay.
That would be a fantastic, that would be a fantastic thing for us to do. But I worry that we still are leaving most voices in the global south in somewhere else. They're certainly not in the ether.
Okay. Do you have recommendations around remuneration for data creators, Indigenous educational science and art and music?
Yes. I mean, obviously the Timnit Gebru's group recently did an in-depth study on people who were working in data centers in Africa, and how poorly paid they are for the work that they do. We need to understand that we can't keep paying people poorly just because they live in the global south. I don't know what the second, the Indigenous persons. We need to have conversations with everybody. It may be that everybody doesn't want to share their data. And I know that there are some Indigenous groups around the world who don't want to share their data with generative AI. And I think we need to listen to people. And what we're not doing, and that's what we're not doing at the moment, because we're all caught up on the hype cycle.
Very true. Thank you. Another question is curious. Sorry, I muted myself. Another question I'll post in the chat. Curious about the term hallucination with regard to AI.
Okay, so hallucination is the interesting term that AI scientists came up with to say that AI is giving you false information. So we call it a hallucination when a computer just doesn't tell you the truth. It doesn't give you the right data. It doesn't give you the right information.
Do you see beneficial global standards coming from the recent 2024 World AI Conference in China last week?
No. I honestly think it's impossible for us to have international standards. And even if we did have international standards, it's almost impossible to create punishment around them, to actually enforce them. And, what's the point of having any law if you can't enforce it. And we certainly, if I think about treaty law, we haven't effectively enforced treaties on anything for a good 10 years. In our current global environment, I think it's going to be really hard.
Definitely. Two more questions.
Just on that,
Yeah.
one of the things that we have been trying to do for maybe the last 7, maybe more years, I can't remember now, it just is a long time, is to get a treaty or an agreement not to use what we call lethal autonomous weapons. Lethal autonomous weapons are the weapons that kill without a human ordering them to kill. They are extremely dangerous. They make landmines look undangerous. That's not a word, but you know what I mean. And we still haven't got anywhere with that. If we can't deal with something as fundamentally dangerous as lethal autonomous weapons, it's hard to think about how we do global governance.
Definitely. I see 3 more questions, and then we're going to move into, well, I don't know if we can get to all of them. We might. Women in AI organization, is that an open group to join?
Yes, yeah, there are lots of groups, but I read in PitchBook yesterday that Girls That Code and another women's organization had lost funding, and I can probably find that and link and put it in the chat for you when we've finished talking. But women entrepreneurs in AI are not funded anywhere near as well as men. It's sort of worse. We all know that there's a problem with funding women, but it's worse in AI. And we are seeing some of these organizations losing their funding as well.
Oh, hopefully we can turn that around. Nasali asks, where is the Global South in the AI conversations? Are they in there?
Not as richly as we would hope that they would be. And that's mainly because, all the generative AI, all the main AI is coming out of companies in the US and coming out of companies in China. India is building a robust AI economy. That's important because one of the problems for India is that they have had a lot of chat rooms. So, when you phone somebody, it's the person in India who is responding. If we implement chatbots in those call centers, then that will be very bad for the Indian economy.
Thank you. One last question, and then we're going to do some reflection questions. What kind of governance might protect children from the hallucinations you mentioned?
Well, I don't think that we can protect children from hallucinations because we can't stop hallucinations. So the way to protect children and us adults who don't know anything about AI is to do that AI 101. Understand what this machine can do, understand what it can't do, understand it can't be your best friend. Or maybe it can, and you prefer to live in a world that is populated by AI chatbots talking to you. I personally don't, but I don't want to prescribe what we want for the future. I want us just to have a conversation about it. But if children don't know that the answers that they're getting might be wrong, then that's a harm.